In the late 1950s, pharmaceutical companies across Europe began marketing a new sedative that promised to revolutionize the treatment of anxiety, insomnia, and morning sickness in pregnant women. The drug was called thalidomide, and it was sold over the counter in more than 20 countries, promoted as completely safe with no dangerous side effects. What followed would become one of the worst pharmaceutical disasters in human history, not through malicious intent, but through catastrophic ignorance. The German manufacturer Chemie Grünenthal had developed thalidomide and begun selling it in West Germany in 1957. The company's marketing emphasized the drug's supposed safety, claiming it was impossible to overdose on thalidomide and that it posed no risks even to the most vulnerable patients. By 1960, thalidomide had been approved in dozens of countries, including Britain, Canada, and Australia. Pregnant women were specifically targeted in advertising campaigns that promised relief from morning sickness without harm to their developing babies. But thalidomide had a horrific property that inadequate testing had failed to reveal. The drug crossed the placental barrier between mother and fetus, and when taken during the first trimester of pregnancy, it catastrophically disrupted fetal development. The result was a condition called phocomelia, where infants were born with severely malformed or completely absent limbs, hands and feet projected directly from shoulders and hips like flippers. Internal organs failed to develop properly. Many babies were born blind, deaf, or with devastating combinations of defects. Between 1957 and 1961, an estimated 10,000 babies worldwide were born with thalidomide-caused deformities. In Germany alone, where the drug was most widely used, between 5,000 and 7,000 children were affected. Approximately 40% of thalidomide babies died within their first year. Those who survived faced lifelong disabilities requiring constant care and assistance. The United States narrowly escaped a similar disaster thanks to Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey, a medical reviewer at the Food and Drug Administration. In September 1960, just 1 month after joining the FDA, Kelsey was assigned to review the application from Richardson Merrill Company to market thalidomide in America under the brand name Kevadon. The company expected rapid approval. Thalidomide was already widely used in Europe and had been portrayed as a wonder drug. But Kelsey examined the application with meticulous scrutiny. She noted that clinical data was lacking, that testimonials replaced scientific methodology, and that the submission said nothing about how the drug might affect pregnant women or developing fetuses. Kelsey's graduate work at the University of Chicago, under Dr. Eugene Geiling, had involved studying how drugs crossed the placental barrier in rabbits. She had discovered that pregnant rabbits could not break down quinine as easily as non-pregnant animals, and that embryos could not metabolize the drug at all. This early research made her uniquely sensitive to the potential dangers of medications taken during pregnancy. When Richardson Merrill submitted their application, Kelsey repeatedly requested additional safety data. The company resubmitted the application 6 times over the course of 14 months. Each time, Kelsey demanded more evidence. Company representatives grew increasingly aggressive, contacting her and her supervisors over 50 separate times, calling her unreasonable, bureaucratic, and, according to Kelsey herself, names that were unprintable. The pressure intensified in December 1960 when Dr. Leslie Florence published a letter in the British Medical Journal connecting thalidomide to peripheral neuritis, nerve damage in the hands and feet of patients who had taken the drug. Kelsey saw this report and immediately added neurological effects to her list of concerns, specifically requesting animal studies to demonstrate the drug would not harm fetuses. In November 1961, physicians in Germany and Australia independently discovered the link between thalidomide and the epidemic of birth defects. Doctors William McBride in Sydney and Widukind Lenz in Hamburg observed that mothers who had taken thalidomide during early pregnancy were giving birth to babies with identical patterns of severe deformities. The drug was rapidly withdrawn from markets worldwide. By that time, more than 10,000 babies had been born with thalidomide-caused disabilities, and thousands more had died in utero or shortly after birth. Kelsey's refusal to approve thalidomide for the American market meant that only 17 American children were affected, all through experimental samples that had been distributed to physicians before official approval. In August 1962, President John F. Kennedy awarded Kelsey the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, making her only the second woman to receive this honor. That same year, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, fundamentally transforming pharmaceutical regulation in the United States. The new law required companies to prove both safety and efficacy before approval, mandated informed consent for clinical trial participants, and gave the FDA significantly greater oversight authority. The thalidomide tragedy stands as a stark reminder that the absence of malicious intent does not prevent catastrophic outcomes. The manufacturers never intended to harm children. The physicians who prescribed thalidomide believed they were helping their patients. But inadequate testing, insufficient regulation, and corporate pressure to rush approval created conditions for a disaster that destroyed thousands of families and changed pharmaceutical oversight forever. On August 8, 1975, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, workers atop China's Banqiao Dam watched in horror as reservoir water began spilling over the crest. They had been frantically piling sandbags for hours while being battered by the most intense rainfall ever recorded in the region. Moments earlier, the sky had briefly cleared, and someone had shouted that the flood was retreating. That hope lasted seconds. What happened next would become the deadliest structural failure in human history. The Banqiao Dam, completed in June 1952 on the Ru River in Henan Province, was part of an ambitious project called Harness the Huai River. Built with Soviet assistance in the aftermath of devastating floods in 1949 and 1950, the dam stood approximately 80 feet high with a clay core surrounded by a sand shell. It was designed to provide flood control, irrigation, and electrical power to a rapidly developing region. The dam had been engineered to withstand what was calculated as a 1-in-1,000-year rainfall event, approximately 300 millimeters of rain per day. But on August 5, 1975, Typhoon Nina collided with a cold front over Henan Province and dropped more than 1,060 millimeters of rain in 24 hours, more than the region's entire average annual rainfall. Witnesses reported that the intensity of the downpour was so extreme that birds were found pummeled to death on the ground. The story of Banqiao's design flaw begins with Chen Xing, one of China's foremost hydrologists. Chen had been involved in the dam's original design and had recommended 12 sluice gates to allow controlled release of floodwater. But during the fervor of rapid dam construction under Chairman Mao Zedong's directives, Chen's design was criticized as excessively conservative. A deputy head of the Water Conservancy Department in Henan Province arbitrarily reduced the number of sluice gates from 12 to 5. Chen Xing vocally opposed the government's dam-building policy, warning that constructing too many dams throughout the region would raise water tables to dangerous levels, and that prioritizing water storage over flood control would lead to disaster. For his outspoken criticism during the Great Leap Forward, Chen was labeled a right-wing opportunist and removed from the project in 1958. Shortly after completion in 1952, cracks appeared in Banqiao Dam. From 1955 to 1956, Soviet engineers supervised repairs and reinforcement, raising the dam by nearly 10 feet. Following this rehabilitation, Banqiao was dubbed the Iron Dam to reflect its perceived invincibility. But the fundamental design flaw remained. 5 sluice gates were simply insufficient to handle extreme water volumes. In 1961, after ongoing problems with the water system became apparent, Chen Xing was brought back to help. He continued warning about the dam's inadequacies and was again removed from the project. His predictions would be vindicated in the worst possible way 14 years later. As Typhoon Nina's unprecedented rainfall overwhelmed the Banqiao Reservoir, operators faced a terrible choice. Opening the sluice gates would release massive volumes of water downstream, where severe flooding was already underway. Initially, they were ordered to keep the gates closed to minimize downstream damage. By the time the decision was made to open them, communication lines had been knocked out by the storm. The operators received no information about conditions outside the dam. The 5 inadequate sluice gates, further obstructed by accumulated silt from the reservoir bed, could not discharge water fast enough. The reservoir level continued rising inexorably. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on August 8th, the Banqiao Dam failed catastrophically. A wall of water, 10 kilometers wide and more than 5 meters high, raced across the flat farmland of Hainan province at speeds reaching 50 kilometers per hour. The torrent demolished everything in its path, tearing up roads, bridges, power lines, and communication systems. Entire villages were swept away in seconds. As the massive flood wave continued downstream, it triggered a domino effect. 62 dams in the region failed in rapid succession, each collapse amplifying the disaster. The Shamantan Dam, which Chen Xing had also criticized for having too few spillway gates, collapsed shortly after Banqiao. More than 10 million people were displaced. The death toll from the initial flooding was staggering, but the aftermath proved equally deadly. With roads destroyed and communication systems down, relief efforts were catastrophically delayed. Survivors trapped on rooftops and small patches of dry land had no access to food, clean water, or medical care. Journalist Yi Si, writing under a pseudonym, later described the scene. Approximately 13 days after the dam collapse, nearly 400,000 people were still stranded. Food was airdropped, but Yi estimated that half of it landed in water. When the floodwaters finally began to recede 2 weeks after the disaster, mounds of corpses lay everywhere, rotting under the hot Sunday disease, and starvation killed tens of thousands more in the weeks that followed. For decades, the Chinese government concealed the full extent of the disaster. The official explanation blamed unprecedented weather, while minimizing human factors. It wasn't until the 1990s, when the book The Great Floods in China's History was published with a preface by former Minister of Water Resources Qian Zhengying, that details of the catastrophe became public. Estimates of the death toll vary dramatically. One author in the book cited 85,600 deaths specifically from the Banqiao collapse. Other sources, including representatives of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference in the 1980s, stated the total death toll from the entire cascade of dam failures reached 230,000 people. Some estimates suggest as many as 240,000 deaths, when accounting for all flooding-related casualties. In 2005, the Discovery Channel's program Ultimate Disasters rated the Banqiao Dam failure as the greatest technological catastrophe in history, surpassing even the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Days after the dam fell, a helicopter carrying senior government officials surveyed the devastation. With them was Chen Xing, the once defamed hydrologist who had warned repeatedly about exactly this scenario. He was brought back, vindicated too late, to help clear the river channels and advise on reconstruction. The rebuilt Banqiao Dam, completed in 1993, incorporated the lessons learned in blood. It was designed with significantly greater discharge capacity and improved spillway systems, but the original disaster stands as a monument to the deadly consequences of ignoring expert warnings, prioritizing political ideology over engineering safety, and building infrastructure that places convenience and cost savings above adequate fail-safes. When Christopher Columbus and his crew landed in the Bahamas in October 1492, they initiated what would become the deadliest unintentional mass casualty event in human history. The explorers carried with them invisible passengers that would prove far more destructive than any weapon they brought. Microorganisms to which European populations had developed immunity over centuries, but to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no defense whatsoever. For approximately 12,000 years, the Americas had been almost completely isolated from the old world of Europe, Africa, and Asia. When the first inhabitants crossed the Bering Land Bridge between 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, they brought few diseases with them. They had no domesticated herd animals like cattle, pigs, sheep, or chickens. In Eurasia and Africa, the domestication of these animals had led to zoonotic diseases, illnesses that jumped from animals to humans and became endemic in human populations. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, and others evolved alongside Old World civilizations, becoming childhood illnesses that killed significant portions of young children but left survivors with partial or complete immunity. The peoples of the Americas had no such diseases. They had domesticated dogs, llamas, alpacas, and turkeys, but these animals did not harbor infections that became widespread human diseases. The indigenous population, estimated at between 40 million and 60 million by 1492, lived in a relatively disease-free environment. They suffered no smallpox, no measles, no chickenpox, no influenza, no typhus, no typhoid fever, no diphtheria, no cholera, no bubonic plague, no scarlet fever, no whooping cough, and no malaria. When Europeans arrived, they brought all of these with them. The pigs aboard Columbus's ships in 1493 immediately spread swine flu, which proved deadly to the Taino population on Hispaniola. Smallpox arrived by 1519 and rapidly spread to mainland Central America and beyond. The first recorded smallpox epidemic in mainland Mexico killed a third or more of the population in just a few months. Measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases followed in devastating waves. The impact was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Indigenous peoples had no previous exposure to these pathogens, and thus no immune system defenses. When someone with measles or smallpox entered a village, the disease would sweep through the entire population. Entire families died with no one left to bury the dead, fetch water, or tend fires. William Bradford, describing smallpox epidemics in what is now Massachusetts in the 1630s, wrote that victims lost strength so quickly they could not perform even basic functions before dying. The diseases spread faster than the explorers themselves. Indigenous trade routes and social networks that had facilitated commerce for centuries now became highways for invisible killers. Communities were devastated before they ever saw a European face. When Spanish conquistadors reached some regions, they found abandoned cities and drastically reduced populations. The diseases had arrived ahead of them. Historians estimate that between 80% and 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within the first 100 to 150 years after 1492. The indigenous population of Peru decreased from approximately 9 million in the pre-Columbian era to 600,000 by 1620. Some Caribbean islands saw their native populations decline by more than 99% by 1600. On the mainland, tribe after tribe was decimated. The Pennacook Confederation in present-day New Hampshire and Massachusetts faced 80 to 90% mortality rates in coastal areas. The Mohawk people were repeatedly struck by smallpox. Throughout what is now Oregon, epidemics killed vast percentages of native populations from the late 1700s through the mid-1800s. This demographic catastrophe has been called the Great Dying, the greatest loss of human life in history relative to pre-existing populations. The scale of death was so immense that it had ecological consequences. Vast agricultural lands were abandoned and returned to forest. The regrowth of vegetation across the Americas may have contributed to a global cooling period in the 16th and 17th centuries by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The Europeans who witnessed these epidemics did not fully understand how diseases spread. They recognized the importance of quarantine but lacked knowledge of microbiology and transmission vectors. Most Europeans interpreted the mass death of indigenous peoples as divine providence, proof that God favored European colonization. Only one documented case exists of Europeans deliberately weaponizing disease. Lord Jeffrey Amherst provided infected smallpox blankets to Native Americans during the 7 Years' War. But this single intentional act pales beside the unintentional Holocaust caused by everyday contact. What makes this tragedy particularly devastating is its unintentional nature. The Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English colonizers who carried these diseases were largely immune themselves and often didn't even know they were infected. A person could carry smallpox or measles while showing no symptoms or only mild illness, then spread it to indigenous populations, among whom it would prove catastrophically lethal. The Columbian Exchange, as historian Alfred Crosby termed it, transformed both hemispheres biologically. Europeans gained valuable crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize that would revolutionize agriculture and nutrition in the Old World. Americans gained horses, cattle, wheat, and other domesticated species. But the most profound and deadly aspect of the exchange was invisible. The diseases that crossed the Atlantic from east to west killed more people than any war, any famine, any natural disaster in human history. Entire civilizations collapsed not from military conquest but from biological catastrophe. The Aztec and Inca empires, which might have resisted Spanish conquest through sheer numbers, were crippled by epidemics that killed the majority of their populations. Political systems fragmented when leaders died. Military resistance became impossible when warriors succumbed to disease. Cultural knowledge was lost when elders perished. The demographic disaster fundamentally altered the course of world history. The drastic reduction in indigenous populations created a labor shortage that European colonizers filled by importing enslaved Africans, leading to the transatlantic slave trade that brought more than 12 million people across the ocean in chains between the 16th and 19th centuries. When we consider the deadliest events in human history, we typically think of wars, genocides, or natural disasters. But the unintentional introduction of Old World diseases to the Americas killed more people than all the wars of the 20th century combined. 90% population loss across 2 entire continents represents a death toll measured in the tens of millions. And it happened not through malicious design, but through the simple act of 2 long-separated biological worlds making contact after 12,000 years of isolation. No conqueror intended this outcome. No explorer set out to commit biological warfare. The catastrophe resulted from historical accident, the collision of populations with incompatible immune systems after millennia of separate development. Yet the result was the deadliest unintentional killing in human history, a demographic apocalypse that reshaped the Americas and the world forever.